Sorry, I was on the wrong slide. Just getting this.
Nice. Excited to see your presentation.
All right, now I guess I'll get started.
I'll go ahead and introduce you, Aspen.
Okay, good.
I'm just going to stick to the words that I know, and you can, of course, introduce yourself in your language as well. So Aspen Decker is a Salish culture and NAS teacher and a speaker of her tribal language, Salish language. She has a Montana Class 7 Native American Language and Culture Educator license, has been teaching Salish for 10 years. This presentation will explore Nqlixŭcutn, Sqlsé, Indigenous place-based storytelling, and culturally responsive teaching strategies to meet the learning needs of Indigenous students. This session investigates the Salish intergenerational transfer of knowledge and ways of connecting language and native cultural arts with STEAM subjects. Participants will take away strategies that can use a multicultural classroom to engage and motivate Indigenous students to excel by connecting them to identity rooted in a foundational Indigenous stories, lifeways, language, and ecology. This session will help educators and administrators to understand the importance of community relationship building and empowering Indigenous youth through identity. So I'm so excited to welcome Aspen Decker. I'm excited to see all of the folks in here, and just kind of sit back and enjoy the presentation. So it's all yours, Aspen.
Okay. Vertraag met Sqlsé. It's in Sqlsé is ayáqn. It's why it's meaning for Sqlsívcutn. As you said, my name is Aspen Decker, and I'm happy to be here and be able to teach you guys a little bit about what I found in my teaching experience with integrating culturally responsive teaching. And I am a member of the Confederated Salesian Kootenai tribe, like ayáqn Salish. Yeah, so let's get started. Sure. Sorry, I got my husband here. He's like helping me get it back to the presentation. All right, but now, so this first, the language up here says Nqlixŭcutn. And so our Nqlixŭcutn, you make this sign. You guys want to make this sign as I go. I'll just try to integrate some of the Plains Indian Sign Language. And so just rubbing your hand around this edge, that means Indian, so like Indigenous. Some tribes, Plains tribes like do this, but Salish, we just kind of do this little round circle thing. And so Sqlsé, that's our Indian way of being, that Nqlixŭcutn. And then that Sqlsívcutn is talking about on our Indigenous land. So there's like those two qliq that you could see there, and that's talking about Indigenous. So on our Indigenous land, Nqlixŭcutn. Oh, you couldn't see the sign. Let's see, can you see if I'm close up? My camera. So there's Indian, Sqlsé. So your hand is right on the palm, circular motion. Nqlixŭcutn. Wow. Enough. Let's see. I'm trying to click that. Oh, now, so here's an overview of what I'll be discussing. So the culturally responsive practices and teaching, and then the Sqlsé ways of being. So I'm going to talk about our seasonal overview of what Salish people do, since that's more of what I'm an expert in as far as an Indigenous community, and connecting to identity will be the next one, and how we connect our students to identity in education. and then implementing these indigenous cultures, depending on like where you're located, into STEAM in our public schools. Right, so culturally responsive practices. And so here's just a table of 3 things that I feel like sometimes we end up thinking that they're sort of the same, even though they're slightly different. So multicultural education or classrooms. You guys can kind of read through this, but like it concerns itself with creating the lenses to recognize and interpret inequality patterns in society. And so a lot of times teachers will include like food, regalia, kind of like that surface level culture in their classrooms. So kind of like powwow things. Sorry, shut this off. And just, yeah, sort of like this material culture. And then for the social justice and education, it centers around having students have this like consciousness about inequality within everyday social, environmental, economic, and political aspects. So oftentimes with that, like if you're a writing teacher, you know, we focus on sort of these contemporary Indigenous issues and about inequality. And so in a lot of ways, these all relate with each other, but the culturally responsive teaching, it's more centered around like the cognitive aspects of teaching and learning. And not only that, it's about Indigenous worldview. So a lot of times we think that because we're adding in like multicultural education with having, you know, feathers, dream catchers, that type of stuff in the classroom, we think it's culturally responsive, but it's really just not quite what responsive teaching is, or culturally responsive teaching, because it needs to be taught in an Indigenous way of going about that. So the way that Indigenous peoples do things, the way that they teach their knowledge. So if we're being culturally responsive and you're wanting to teach about even powwow or anything like that, then we need to be considerate about how we're teaching that. So as an Indigenous person, like we kind of understand how to talk about these things, but then if you're non-Indigenous and non-Native, then you really need to think about whose voice you're representing, you know, and making sure that it's an authentic voice that you're teaching to the students. And so making sure that like what's the powwow or whatever aspect of culture that you're trying to teach, we really need to understand how do Indigenous peoples teach this to their children? How is it part of their collective memory in their culture? So like the ways in which Indigenous people transmit culture, that's what we need to look at. So a lot of times our Indigenous communities, it's about a collective memory, a collective culture. And so a lot of times that's having hands-on culture. So you're learning by doing. And so we need to think about like, what is it that's integral to say powwows? And so it's like, here's the things that they need to know. And the way that elders or families teach their children, that's what you would need to bring into the classroom to really be culturally responsive in your teaching. So Indigenous voices. And so that's like the most important aspect of culturally responsive teaching, is making sure that it's from Indigenous peoples. So for example, there's quite a few people, like even on my reservation, that are non-Native that have grown up here. And a lot of times they're like, well, I feel like I'm part of the community. I'm Salish because I grew up here and I have all these Salish friends, or, you know, they're like, I grew up with Indians, so I know them. But, you know, that's kind of from still not an Indigenous perspective. You're still an outsider, even if you grew up in the community with like Indigenous peoples. So the environment, the land, everything that you're experiencing is completely different from that of like an ethnic group. And so their culture everything, their ideologies and the way that they see our environment, our place where we're at is much different than if you were a non-native growing up even on a reservation like the Flathead Reservation. And so instead of trying to be the expert in a culture, you want to make sure that it's not from your view, trying to be like, oh, I've attended powwows before and I've gone to like Arlie powwow, Browning powwow, you know, like all these things. And just from like what you're like seeing at the powwow is going to be probably a lot different from somebody who's like a dancer and who's, you know, been part of like powwow culture and knowing like why we do these dances, why there's certain parts of the regalia. And so that's where you're really going to want to have that voice, that authentic voice. And so some of the ways that you could do this is by asking some of the knowledge keepers in the community that you're teaching, or there's usually a culture committee in all of our tribal communities in Montana. And so just getting a hold of them, asking them where resources are. There's always like history, and at least with like our culture committee here, there's a lot of different elder stories. There's like kind of some of our seasonal round, and there's also books out there that discuss what we did a long time ago. And then a lot of times you could also, you know, talk to a Indigenous person today and see like kind of what the changes were with like the Indigenous tools that we might use during like our digs, our bitterroot dig. It's changed from like, you know, those older tools, even though some people, like I still use some of those old petzas, those diggers. But then there's like, you know, these changes of like using metal diggers. And, you know, we want to teach both traditional and contemporary culture, but then also keeping this integral information. So with the petzas, with the bitterroot dig, what is this like common integral information that we're passing on, transmitting to our children and the next generations? You know, what's that important information, even though things might slightly change, even the places that we might gather or how we get there. You know, we have our cars, we have our chairs, or you could sit there and peel the roots, but it's important to talk about like, how did our ancestors do these things? And how do we do it now? And how is it relevant to our kids in the schools? Check this. Now, so I'm going to talk about Salish or Sqlsé ways of being. And so I think this is important in my presentation to talk about first, because I had a very cultural upbringing and, you know, gathering, doing these seasonal things with Salish. And so the way that Salish, their ways of knowing our culture here, it has a lot of similarities to other Indigenous tribes, even in Montana, but there's always these like slight differences in, you know, what we did seasonally or some of our protocols, our teachings. And so this is sort of like what I'm an expert in, is more of Salish culture. And so I want to share what I do with my family, what I've done with my students, and yeah, just gonna show what we do throughout the year. And the thing that ties us to identity, and me specifically and my children, and how I would use this ways of being in my classroom. So now, first I'll start off with Nqlixŵcutn, Salish. There's 24 or 23 different Salesian language families. So this is a map that I did for my master's thesis, and it was just to show all the Salish tribes. So we have a lot of different bands. And we're the interior Salish, so this yellow down there, that Nqlixŵcutn, that is Montana Salish. And we were a nomadic tribe, still are in some ways. So that means we moved around seasonally. And that's why our territory is so big. It goes all the way you know, into Blackfeet country. And so there's a lot of overlap within our tribes too. So this map, like, it doesn't show the other tribes other than Salish, but if you had like Blackfeet, Cree, all that, like it all kind of overlaps. But we were way over in like Great Falls, all the way down into Yellowstone, Missoula, Bitterroot Valley, and the Bitterroot Valley is where the Salish people primarily stayed throughout most of the year until the Hellgate Treaty, when we got removed from the Bitterroot. But that was probably like 6 months of the year during those cold winter months. We were down in the Bitterroot Valley. So like by Hamilton, that whole area was like our primary home. And then from there, we traveled around depending on the plants and animals that we were harvesting and killing. And so a lot of times we would go to the plains down by Yellowstone, Bozeman, all those areas to get our bison. And so that's where we were through some of the summer. And then, yeah, so that was our big area. And then during fall time, we went all the way to Kettle Falls. So that's down in Washington. And we would meet up with a lot of these other Salish bands. And we had our different like designated spots on the river where we'd get the salmon in Kettle Falls. And so, yeah, we're all really connected to these other Salish people, even through like languages, like the way that our articulation happens, all these sounds. Like it's kind of hard for me to understand the coastal Salish because they have a lot of differences, but yet there's quite a few similarities in like our nouns and like the structures of the sentences. And then the interior Salish, which is most of like kind of that like where the yellow is, that's not all crunched together, you know, that whole area is mostly the interior Salish bands. And so they're pretty easy for me to understand because there's just like slight differences and kind of rules to how they vary. So we are the Salish and Sqlsé people, the Salish and Sqlsé. And so for my family, the first thing that we notice is usually Nqlixŵcutn or the ayáqn. Ayáqn in English is the first flower. Forgetting buttercup. Yeah, buttercup is like our indicator. So we have all these different indicators throughout the year, our seasons, and that tells us when something's about to happen. And it's important for Indigenous peoples, our tribes, especially a long time ago, to have these indicators so you don't miss things. Because if you ever gather these seasonal like plants, then you know that you have to get out there right away. Otherwise, sometimes you end up missing your opportunity to go get your your Bitterroot or Sqlsé. I missed that a few years. That the Sqlsé, that foam berry, and that's to make like Indian ice cream. And it's interesting the changes from climate change. You know, we have like probably a 3-week to a month difference. And what I've noticed just from the last like 10 years of gathering, it's changed that much. And even like some of our months names, or Sqlsé, the Bitterroot and Camas month, it's almost like shifting into the month, you know, prior to that. So that's where we just always have to be watching for the indicators, being out there, knowing when things are about to happen. So that buttercup, that's that first flower of the season, and that's when we know, okay, everything's about to happen as far as like spring growth. And so the Nqlixŵcutn, this balsam root, that's like the next thing that happens as soon as you start to see those Sqlsé. So these really just came out in the last like week, where you just see them all over like the bison range. And this is like our very first foods too. It helps to like clean us out, and we peel it. It tastes like celery once you peel that skin off of it. So it's a really sad plant. And then this is my students that I took out last week when we went to the Bitterroot dig. So we pulled over and got some of this Nqlixŵcutn. Nqlixŵcutn is its name. Nqlixŵcutn balsam root. And that's my baby. Now, and so our the Bitterroot. This is one of our staple Salish foods. It's really important. It's like the Bitterroot, heart of the Bitterroot it's the heart of the Salish people. It's like what I heard an elder say, and it totally makes sense because this is one of our very important foods for us. We had to gather a lot of this, and it helped with our well-being, our food, to keep us healthy, keep us from starvation. And our oral story for Bitterroot is talking about an older lady who saw the people starving, and she started to cry and her tears hit the ground, and it made this bitter. So the spirit bird, the blackbird, that's how we got our Sqlixŵcutn came to be. It saved the people from starvation. And there's just so many health benefits to it. So I'm always out there digging with my kids as soon as we have this time frame. And it's really short, like 3 weeks, maybe a month, mostly 3 weeks that you have to like go out and dig. So you just like go out there all day, dig, and that's what we like to eat, at least here and there throughout the winter, since we don't gather enough to sustain us. That's Sqlixŵcutn. It's really important that we're out there and with our elders. So up here in that corner is Eva Boyd. She's one of our Salish elders. She's like a Spokane Salish, but her and a lot of the elders there, they share stories and, talk, and just like the laughter. It's really good medicine to be out there with our elders and getting our students out there to these different events. That way they're getting this exposure to elders while we still have them here, and getting to hear their language, the story, learning something about what it means to be Salish, what it means to be out there digging on the land. And so some of the elders, they talk about, depending on how good of a Salish woman you are, depends on how white and clean that bitter it is. So it has a skin on it. And yeah, they just talk about like what it means to be a good Salish woman, what like your husband would have wanted is to like be a good cleaner and have all this white Sqlixŵcutn. And then the next thing that we do pretty much right after Sqlixŵcutn is our Sqlsé. That's the blue camas. And so we go out there, we dig, and it's a lot deeper than what the Sqlixŵcutn is. So our petzas sometimes have these pegs on it. So we have to have like even a longer petza, a longer digging stick, because these are like 6 feet down in the dirt, and you want those bulbs that are in the center. So the center has our moss and the camas pit. It's like after the camas bake, I put all that on there. And so it tastes really good. It's kind of chalky in your teeth. I don't know, it's like kind of greasy. It just gets all stuck to your teeth, but it's pretty good. And you definitely have to kind of have that not acquired taste, but you have to be exposed to it at a young age, I think, to eat a lot of it. Because like my husband didn't have any until he was with me, and then he just got sick after eating like 5 of them. So I think Lewis and Clark also like documented that about like coming to the Salish and getting all sick from eating too much blue camas. So yeah, just making sure your students don't overeat it. You could eat it raw too, just don't eat more than like a couple, probably your first time. The Sqlsé, it's just really good medicine, beautiful to be out in all this purple, bluish flower. And it's just, yeah, really competent, really beautiful. And you could use the entire stem, the flowers, for different things. Like I like to keep the flowers just in a vase, but then the big leaves that it has, I usually end up making like a woven basket, or at least try to, make use of everything, since they're just so glorious, they're beautiful. This is my Sqlsé, my daughter, just gathering a few things. So she's getting the sahech, our wild onions, getting some punch berries, the juniper berries, and then just some of those pine tree starts. It's good for a few different things like hair. So we're always just out there trying to gather, because I think like the best time of the year is springtime, because everything's out. We're able to gather all these foods, and we have to do it right away, otherwise we miss the opportunity. So just teaching them about the importance of reciprocity, giving back, giving that offering is really important for students too. With my students at Sqlsé, I don't know if you mentioned that in my intro, but I'm a Salish teacher, NAS teacher at St. Ignatius High School. And so I've been taking my students out to gather native plants, and I make sure that we have like our offerings, so like tobacco to give, and I make them like kind of like hear me talk about it. And so it's just like you guys need to be quiet, we need to give thanks to this this plant, because in our Indigenous communities, a lot of times you don't like feel like, oh, I have to explain, this part of it, because it's just so natural when you're immersed in culture about like giving that tobacco. But our students, a lot of them aren't exposed to culture. And so I think it's good to explain why we give that tobacco and what we're doing, and teaching them to talk to those plants, because we want them to continue to grow and we don't want to deplete the resources. And some of the other things we do is like hunting. So I do a lot of like hunting, get a lot of deer, and I got some bison too. So we rely on a lot of like game meat. So our or some kuwe and the Nqlixŵcutn, all this different meat. We I've been like cutting it up with either my students or my kids, and just making sure that they're learning, these kind of important things that like the elders always talk about, and how to cut the meat right. So you're not just cutting big chunks, just really explaining to them about cutting up the meat, the full process of the deer, gutting it, all that. Like I was gonna try to go hunting before the end of the year, so my students could see me like gut it and do all that, like the whole process, but I haven't got around to it. So I think next fall I'll end up doing that with my students, just going out, showing them the entire process and how we use the bone marrow, and sometimes even that like blood, and just cutting it up, the hides. I think that's an important part, is our hide tanning. And so on the right is a picture of me and my kids. We're just stretching a hide about one of these camps. And then there's again Eva Boyd, and so she's teaching me how to do sally bag weaving. And so our Indigenous tools are a big part of our gathering as well. So we want to have our baskets or different things that are helpful in gathering our native plants. And it's a big part of culture, because the way that Eva talks about the sally bag too is that it's a part of every aspect of our culture, and the way that it like weaves in who we are as Sqlsé people, our language. There's just like stories, there's so much that's tied to just being with the elders. So it's really important to give that opportunity to our students to have elders and knowledge keepers to come into the classrooms and talk to them, because just that interaction of being is where, like the magic happens. So instead of like trying to be like, oh, we have this full agenda for this elder, like she needs to come talk about this, and this, like you don't want to have, so much structure sometimes with culture. It's really good to just let them be. And so when you're weaving, there's always like stories that come out, and then they eventually end up, talking about like who they learned from for whatever you're doing, like the sally bag weaving. And it just really gets to the, the bones of culture, and like about like what it means to do these things, how it benefits us, what we could do with it, how things have changed. So she talks about how like the cedar roots is kind of, that more traditional, or that Spetsen, that dog bane that you make into cordage. Like there's older ways of weaving, like the material you use, versus like yarn today. And so there's always these like cultural changes, and it's just good medicine to be there with the elders, listen to them, learn from them, and then, let it go to your heart so you remember it. And then that's where you continue to share what you learn as part of that intergenerational transfer. And so that's what I'm always trying to do with my kids. Everything I've learned from my elders, from my kahe, my tupie, my yaya, all of them, like my leaders, my teachers that I've learned culture, language, everything with, is what I always share. So Pat Pierre was my main language teacher. So he's the one that I'm always, resharing his stories, or like Joe Pablo, quite a few different like elders around our league communities, like who I learned from as like a really young kid. So just keeping their stories going. And it seems like we just could hear these stories from different elders, and there might be like slight changes, in the story, but it's good to keep that going, because our Salish culture and a lot of Indigenous cultures are based around oral storytelling. So a lot of us didn't have a written orthography, so no written documents or books about our history, our culture, our language, all that stuff. So it's really embedded in our stories, our storytelling. And so it's always important that we continue to retell these stories so it stays fresh in our minds, and these kids start to hear it, and then it's gonna come back to them if they don't think it's quite important yet, or it just kind of goes through one ear and out the other, or just they kind of like hear it and they're like, okay, yeah, I heard that one before. It might come to them later on once they're adults, and that's when they're really going to appreciate these stories and be like, oh yeah, I remember my teacher is telling this one story, and then I remember my tupia told that too before, and then it's going to be like, oh, that's why they told this story. Like it starts to make sense to them sometimes as adults, and maybe once they become parents, and then they're able to transmit that culture onto their children. I guess I didn't talk about these pictures very much. This is a really cute technique for hide tanning when you get to the part of like stretching it right before you brain it. They used to put like babies on the hide, and so that would help to stretch it. And so we were just like singing and just playing with them and kind of making it like bounce them up in the air, and so it stretched it out really well. And he was just laughing. It's cute. Now for salmon and fishing. So this is like another big part of what Salish people did closer to like fall time. So after we did our bison hunt, then we would go over to Kettle Falls. And so going down river, we were also canoe people. So our Salish over here had a lot of like plains kind of culture, but we still had that more like water and canoe, fish-based culture, because a lot of our other culture or our other Salish bands are along the coast, and so they're big on like salmon, whales, all that. So we would go that way to get our salmon, because up Kettle Falls was just kind of one of those places we'd go. So going downriver towards like the Kalispels, the upper and lower Sqlsé, we're really close with them because we're always going up and down the river to see each other. So that's down like by us, Washington, past like Sandpoint. And so we meet up with them, maybe take a break and then continue on with them and travel all the way to Kettle Falls. And so in Kettle Falls, that's where we got a lot of our salmon. And there's just a lot of information that's embedded in these old stories of what we did, of how we processed these fish, the animals, the plants. And it's just important that we continue to talk about how our elders, how our ancestors gave back, how they respected the fish, and the things that they would do. So like when they would gut these fish, they made sure that they dug a hole and put the guts in it, so they didn't just throw it back in the river, and because they thought it was kind of a way of like throwing it in those fishes, those salmon's face, like, oh, just kill a lot of your other people, I guess your other fish, you're just like throwing it back in there. It's kind of like mocking them, it's disrespecting them. And so that's where we were like, oh, let's dig a hole, put all those guts off into the dirt. And so that was just our way of kind of respecting them. And then each of those different Salish bands had a spot on the river, and that's where they went to every year. It was our seasonal campsite. And then there was just like different roles for the women versus the men. The men were the main ones that were out there spearfishing, and then the women were usually like upriver of that. And then they were doing all this like smoking. So how this is like staked out, there was this way, or just hanging it on, kind of this rack. And then after all the salmon of the day was smoked, then they would have like distributors, and they would give it out to each of the families depending on their size of family. So if it was a big family, they give them more, less people, less. And they were fair about it and making sure that everyone left that camp with a huge pile of salmon, dried salmon, and we're able to take it back home and then have that as part of our winter foods. Enough. And then once it became winter time, that was when it was time for storytelling. There's a lot that I end up kind of skipping over as far as like summer and spring. There's just like so many different things that we gathered and harvested throughout that time. So there's a lot more that we did, but just kind of moving through like some of these really important things that we gathered and did. and I'm into the Sqlsé, the storytelling. And this happens once all the work's done. And so throughout the spring and summer, that's where it's hard work. You're out there from, dawn to evening, you're out there just gathering, getting things, making sure that every 3-week